Today, we talk about how Marshall McLuhan helps us make sense of artificial intelligence, social media, and even autonomous weapon systems. Check it out.
Nobody on social media wants to remain private. They want to be public. They want to be involved. And so privacy and individualism go out the window.
If liberalism died with the print age, as McLuhan contends, then Deneen and the other anti-liberal voices on the right are kicking a dead horse.
I do remember writing, in fairness, the critics of liberalism make the same mistaken assumption as current defenders of liberalism. They both assume that liberalism still exists. And McLuhan's sobering view is it doesn't exist any longer. Academics and scholars look into a mirror, but like narcissists, they see what they want to see, which is not the same as reality itself. Elon Musk fits very well with the digital age because he wants to be popular. He wants to be liked. That's why he bought Twitter, after all, and renamed it X. We don't simply use our technologies or media, we end up worshiping them, again, like narcissists. And that is the biblical definition of idolatry. He said in an interview that he is opposed to all change, all innovation, but he wants to try to understand it. And he was frustrated by the attitude that if you talk about something, then you're in favor of it.
Concepts with Sean Watley.
Hello, welcome to Concepts. My name is Sean Watley, and today we have Professor Grant Havers back with us. He's the chair of the Department of Philosophy at Trinity Western, and he's an expert on the conservative tradition and on Marshall McLuhan. He's just published a book out last week, actually, September 15th, called The Medium is Still the Message. And it's fascinating, and I use that word with intention, how Havers has been able to apply all of the current cutting-edge issues and controversies within the conservative movement to McLuhan's thought. So, for example, post-liberalism. According to Marshall McLuhan, we're in a post-literate age. So, in other words, a lot of the ideas and ways of thinking that we're stuck with are actually obsolete in light of the current environment that we find ourselves in. And so attacking liberalism, as the post-liberals do, whom I love, is actually doesn't make sense. So we get a better understanding of what does McLuhan mean by the medium is the message. One of the most exciting things we talk about is the rear view mirror thinking. So we tend to analyze, especially in politics, what's going on by what has happened in the past. Marshall McLuhan would say that's absolutely wrong. We're using an obsolete viewpoint or mindset. We spend a bit of time on formal causality, basically looking at the potentialities of things. When you create an atomic bomb, Marshall McLuhan argues that it will be used. It is part of the nature of that thing, that it will end up being used to its fullest effect. And so a very interesting application of formal causality there. Just an amazing discussion. It's deep, it's rich, it's packed. You're going to love this book. It's unusual that a philosophy book is so fun to read and so applicable to what's going on right now. Once again, thanks for stopping by. I apologize for being a little bit too excited, but I really enjoyed this content, especially. Please click like or subscribe. Tell me what you think, and let's get on with the show. Professor Havers, welcome back.
Good to be here.
I don't want to waste too much time telling you how wonderful your book is. It is wonderful. People have to buy it for Christmas or whatever. It's called The Medium is Still the Message, Marshall McLuhan for Our Time. It's unusual to have such a fun, provocative book in political philosophy. This was just published September 15th. I was able to get one of the first copies, and I couldn't put the thing down. It basically ruined 8 days of my life because I just kept reading it and making... I'm embarrassed to say that every page is covered with pencil marks, but anyways, because there's so much that I want to get to, I want to give a bit of a structure to where we're going to go. We're going to talk about a brief bio and some of his major themes. So major themes up front, we'll hit those and deal with them. But where you get to the provocative issues, and then we'll finish up with solutions and then some of the struggles for people on the non-left or in the conservative camp itself. So I just offer that so that people know where we're going. I think McLuhan is the closest thing we get to a conservative rock star. Tell us about McLuhan and why he was so famous.
Well, Marshall McLuhan spent his formative years in Western Canada. He was born in Edmonton in 1911, and his family moved out to Winnipeg shortly after that, where he spent the rest of his formative years. Winnipeg was experiencing a boom at that time because of World War I, and the demand for raw materials from the Canadian Army created that boom. So he and his family spent several years in Winnipeg. He studied at the University of Manitoba, eventually majoring in the study of English literature. He graduated with a BA and MA from the U of Manitoba, and then ended up migrating across the pond to Cambridge in Great Britain, and further deepened his study of English literature, Cambridge, and eventually wrote a dissertation on the Renaissance satirist and humanist Thomas Nash. The title of the thesis being The Classical Trivium, which he defended in absentia during World War II because of all the U-boats milling around the Atlantic Ocean. He wasn't able to travel to Britain. By that time, he was married to a Texan woman by the name of Corinne Lewis, and they ended up raising 7 children together. But after World War II, he was teaching back in North America. He had already taught at universities like St. Louis University, but ended in the University of Wisconsin. But after World War II, he taught at Assumption University in Windsor, Ontario, which is now the University of Windsor, but at that time it was a Catholic institution. He met Wyndham Lewis there. Anyone who studies the history of the political right knows who Wyndham Lewis was, and greatly was impressed with Lewis's kind of artistic understanding of not just art, but politics and media and so forth. And I shouldn't neglect to mention that before that, he had converted to Catholicism in the late 1930s, which would explain why he ended up at Assumption, and ultimately acquired a teaching post at St. Michael's College at the University of Toronto, which was a Catholic affiliate of the school at the time. At the time, it was still, in a sense, autonomous from that of the University of Toronto. So his Catholicism is a really important part of understanding his work. So throughout the 1950s, he was teaching English literature at St. Michael's College, but he also became more interested in the study of media after acquiring research grants that allowed him to hire teams of researchers, colleagues, or students to study the media. He started to publish on the media as well. So in 1962, he published the Gutenberg Galaxy, which was a study of the print revolution, how the print age, the Gutenberg printing press, had revolutionized history. But his most famous work was published in 1964, Understanding Media, the Extensions of Man. That really began to put McLuhan on the map. Powerful people, business and government started to notice this otherwise obscure professor of literature at a Canadian university. So from 1964 to 1969, McLuhan became the academic version of a rock star, practically a household name who almost every other week was on TV, giving interviews, giving talks, even appearing on the TV comedy show Laugh-In, where Goldie Hawn famously asked, "What you doing, Marshall McLuhan?" And he caught the ear of powerful politicians as well, corporate executives, of course. Many of them didn't quite understand what he was saying. But, of course, his most famous phrase, which I think he coined around 1959, was and is, "The medium is the message," which later became reinvented as "the medium is the massage." Kind of a funny story there. In the late 60s, he had put together kind of a picture book illustrating "The medium is a message," and that was the original title of the book. But due to a printer's error, message was mistakenly printed as massage. McLuhan was told about this printer error. He said, "That's great. We should keep the word massage. Don't correct that error, because that's what the media do." Unbeknownst to most human beings, they massage our senses and often distort or certainly alter our understanding of reality. So the heyday of McLuhan was the late 1960s. Throughout the 1970s, the last decade of his life, interest tended to decline in McLuhan. He even had trouble attracting graduate students at his Center for Technology at the University of Toronto, which is hard to believe. But interest did decline. He was still being interviewed and still being asked for advice, but not on the scale of the 1960s. And when he passed away on New Year's Eve, around 1980, he had not been forgotten, but certainly interest had greatly waned at that point. So that's a very brief and incomplete biographical sketch.
And you were saying even that John Lennon was seeking him out, and for a conservative professor of literature in Canada, that's just amazing. So we got to clear up some of the common misconceptions. I confess I was completely wrong on the meaning of media. Medium is the message. I always said media is the message. And my misconception was this. I thought that if you talk, or if you listen to the radio, or if you watch a TV program, the message you get will be different. And you say, well, that's true. That's partly true. But actually, McLuhan was saying that the media itself creates a whole environment, and that environment shapes the message, and it shapes us, and it kind of puts us into narcosis, and a couple of the other themes that he brings out. So I wonder if you could dilate on this concept of the environment that the media creates, or the medium creates, and the idea of global village and ecology of media. So all of that's related. I told my wife this, and she said, yeah, well, of course, everybody knows that. So maybe everybody already knows this, but I suspect some people may have missed this crucial point of medium is the message.
Right. As McLuhan constantly pointed out, if people understand it, they usually understand it after the fact, when it's late. But that's right. The medium is the message does point to one of McLuhan's most important distinctions, kind of an artistic distinction between figure and ground, ground being just a synonym for the environment. So for McLuhan, what a new medium does, one that is not fully understood, if it's understood at all, creates an environment that usually people are not aware of. They're focused on the figure, which is usually the object of the medium in question. It could be a speaker, or it could be some other obvious focus of interest. But the far more important change is the fact that the new medium brings in a whole new environment, which we're not fully aware of. He liked to use the analogy of the fish in the water. He turned it into a joke that we don't know who discovered water, but we're pretty sure it's not a fish. So even though we can be immersed in a new environment, immersion or involvement does not count as understanding or awareness. So we're like the fish in the water. We're so used to the water, we're not even aware of it. So that's what a new medium does. And McLuhan demonstrated in his different works, at least beginning with the Gutenberg galaxy, that very often these effects are subtle. They happen gradually throughout time. So, for example, Gutenberg's invention of the printing press eventually inspired nationalism because people through the printing press could read books in their own language, their vernacular. And out of that, gradually rose nationalism. But also public education became a fixture of modern life because of literacy. Everyone could learn literacy by reading books, thanks to Gutenberg's invention. So this happened over several centuries, and it's a safe bet that Gutenberg didn't realize what were all the effects of his invention. So that's the way a new medium operates. We're not really aware of the effects, the most important being a new environment that affects everything: politics, religion, culture, identity, you name it. A new medium leaves nothing untouched. And the problem is we're not aware of it until it's too late to do anything about it.
Right. Brilliant. So yeah, I was completely ignorant to that understanding of medium is the message, and that's beautiful. I wasn't going to get into his 4 laws of media, and that's what I was looking up when you were talking, but I thought, doggone it, I'm going to have to actually talk about them, because you talk about the environment and how the environment changes everything. And in fact, it doesn't just change and add something new, it actually makes many things obsolete. And that's going to lead into our discussion about the rear view mirror. So just very quickly on page 38, the 4 laws as illustrated by, he called it the tetrad. And he said they happen simultaneously. Quote, each medium obsolesces an old pattern. So that's the first one. Number 2, retrieves an older one. Number 3, enhances or extends an existing one. And number 4, reverses this enhanced feature into its opposite, end quote. So when I read those, I thought, oh, come on, Professor Haver, this is way too hard to follow. I'm never going to be able to apply this to anything. But by the time I got to the end of your book, I realized, oh, yeah, you basically are living that out and talking about obsolescence and getting these older oral traditions or a space-based versus a time-based way of thinking, and then turning things into its opposite. So it turns out that this tetrad is actually really, really important. At least I think that's what you're trying to say. So can you talk a little bit about how this environment actually turns things upside down? And you can mention oral versus oral tribal versus individual visual, and time-based versus space-based. So talk as much as you want on how the environment actually, a new media actually can twist the environment in such a way that it makes what we're talking about obsolete.
And the whole point of the tetrad, which corresponds with 4 different laws of media, according to McLuhan, is to help us anticipate the effects of a new media before they actually happen, which may sound bizarre. How can we anticipate something before it happens? But that's the point of the tetrad, which he and his son, Eric McLuhan, discussed in a co-published book, The Laws of Media. Came out after the death of Marsh McLuhan. But the point of the tetrad is to help us control as well as make sense of a new medium. So they're called laws because in McLuhan's view, every medium has has had these effects or has demonstrated these laws or patterns throughout its history. So I think somewhere in the book I mentioned social media. Social media, of course, enhance instantaneous communication. That's pretty easy to figure out. Every electric or digital medium enhances speed of light communication. But social media also reversed creation into imitation. So instead of encouraging creation, social media encourage kind of the parrot or imitation of reality, which doesn't have any real originality to it. It also obsolesces self-reflection, or what McLuhan sometimes called the private self. Nobody on social media wants to remain private. They want to be public. They want to be involved. And so privacy and individualism go out the window. And last but not least, social media retrieve a world of magic. They create a world that, in a sense, is not real. I think TikTok could put that perfectly. At best, it's a second-tier reality, to use Eric Falkland's term. But there is something magical about social media because it can imitate something so quickly that, in fact, is not truly real. So those four laws of media are applicable to every single medium. But I think McLuhan also thought that it's more important than ever to understand the laws of media in the electric age. Of course, he didn't live to see the digital age, but I think it applies there too. Because in the electric age, at least we can see these changes happen instantaneously. It's not like waiting around for the printing press to bring about nationalism. That took centuries. But in real time, electric and now digital media can bring about changes that are visible. So there's really no excuse for failing to anticipate the immediate effects of now digital media. And yet that still happens. One just has to look at artificial intelligence. The effects of AI are much faster, more visible than any other medium, and yet people are still playing catch-up with their understanding of it.
Brilliant. Yeah, I'm glad you brought in social media and AI. I'm probably going to listen to this later as I'm editing it and thinking, "Oh my gosh, I got way too excited. I didn't even read the title of the guy's book." And yeah, but we're getting there. We're getting there. So I was going to talk about the rear view mirror thinking, but I think now that we've mentioned the tetrad and the unintended consequences, and you've mentioned it a few times, I think that's one of the really exciting features, at least I thought was really exciting in your book, is this theme of formal causality. And I was going to ask you to talk about that by using an example from page 157. You talk about LAWS, Lethal Autonomous Weapons Systems. And I didn't know about these, but if you could tell us about them. Basically, they're drones that go kill things all by themselves. And you apply his four laws. You say they enhance destructive power, and I'm only reading these just in case you had forgotten what you wrote. They enhance the destructive power, they reverse or flip the role of the creators into merely technicians, they retrieve the fast draw of the typical sheriff, and then most disturbingly, they obsolesce soldiers. So I don't know if you remember applying those four laws to the LAWS system. I wonder if you could dilate on that a little bit.
When listening to you, I just remembered why Plato warned about writing in his famous dialogue, The Phaedrus. This is kind of a side note, but McLuhan was very interested in Plato's insight that writing would affect the memory. If you can write everything down, you won't remember it as much.
That's right.
Your sideway point. I do remember that. Formal causality, of course, is a type of cause that Aristotle discussed as one of the four most important kinds of causes that can explain things. But a formal cause is really the essence of something. It makes it what it is. So Aristotle was really the first philosopher to articulate this in a sophisticated way. The problem is that it's also a cause that's not easily understood. And it directly relates to the idea the medium is the message, because for McLuhan, following the studies of the great Canadian historian Harold Ennis, McLuhan believed that every medium has intrinsic properties, or what Aristotle would call an essence, properties that will happen regardless of the intentional or conscious purpose behind its usage. So for McLuhan, how we intend to use a medium is far less important than the form or formal cause of the medium itself. So, I mean, you mentioned these lethal autonomous weapon systems. I think another way of illustrating the same point is to look at an atomic weapon. The formal cause of an atomic weapon is its destructive power. Mm. So I think in McLuhan's point of view, that's worth pointing out, because he rejected the view that a technology, including a weapon, can be used for good or bad purposes depending on the conscious intent of the person using it. For McLuhan, that's very simple-minded. To say that an atomic weapon is neither good nor bad, it just depends on how it's being used, ignores the fact that an atomic weapon has an essence. It has a form which potentially, most probably, leads to its destructive power. And a lot of McLuhan's critics rejected that. They thought that it's ridiculous to say that there are intrinsic properties embedded within any technology, because don't we have control of technology? Can't we use it for good or for evil? In Understanding Media, he countered that argument by using the example of a smallpox virus. He said it would be absurd to say that a smallpox virus is good or bad depending on its usage. It's far more probable and far more consistent with formal causality to say that it'll be used for bad purposes. And I think that's what he would say about these lethal autonomous weapons. It's possible to imagine good use, but unfortunately there are these intrinsic properties, or what Harold Ennis called biases, built within a medium that people are not aware of. So we're back to the medium as the message. We may think that we understand technology in terms of how we use it for good or evil, but we're probably unaware of these intrinsic properties that are more likely to be activated by a new medium.
Brilliant. So just before we get to what I think is a extremely juicy part, where you take on the whole of the post-liberal movement around the world, it's just like you drop the gloves. So just before we get there, I realize there's one more concept that we have to get you to explain. And McLuhan talked about the electric age, we might say the digital age, as being evidence of a post-literate society. And so I want you to explain or dilate on the difference between a literate versus a post-literate society, including some of the ways of thinking in the literate space, so privacy, logic, linear thinking, that sort of thing. So I'm wondering if you could develop that, and then that should set the stage for our ultimate question here about rear view thinking, where Professor Havers takes on the whole world. So set up the literate post-literate concept for us.
Yeah, that's a really important part of McLuhan's philosophy or historiography. So every medium encourages certain values or attitudes that help or hinder the understanding of reality. So the printing press, of course, enabled the rise of literacy. I don't think anybody would dispute that. But for McLuhan, literacy comes with certain values that are specific to literacy. One is privacy. According to McLuhan, reading a book is a very solitary kind of experience, at least with the rise of the modern era. Medieval scribes, of course, read out loud. Nothing wrong with that. But in the early modern era, literacy, which of course was a result of Gutenberg's invention, encouraged private reading and thus privacy, a sense of the private self, who has to leave the fuss and bother of the world and find a quiet place. One wants to read a book seriously. So privacy and literacy go hand in hand. So do individuals. So for McLuhan, it's no accident that with the rise of print media, you have liberalism, which of course is the philosophy of individualism. So it makes sense that if a private self reads, it will follow that an individual self emerges from that. So it's very different from what McLuhan called tribalism. More on that later. And then another value attached to literacy is detachment. And of course, the rise of detachment in terms of separating oneself from one environment for the sake of objectivity, for the sake of getting the facts right, is an effect of print as well. So privacy, individualism, and detachment would be impossible to understand. Their emergence would be very hard to explain without taking into account print media. So, of course, this affects politics. Again, for McLuhan, there'd be no such thing as liberalism, where takes into account the values of literacy. You could even say the idea of the literate liberal is almost redundant in McLuhan's view. Of course, the liberal had to be literate, but that's very different from tribalism. And there are two different kinds of tribalism that McLuhan alludes to. They're both quite different. There's pre-literate tribalism, with which we would associate ancient civilizations. But there's post-literate tribalism, which is a side effect of the electric and digital ages. But whatever the difference is, tribalists don't want privacy. They don't want to be private. They're part of a tribe after. So the idea of an individual or private self is contrary to the tribal mentality. And that's not a criticism, just different from literate values. Tribalists do not see literacy as important. They're more committed to oral communication. Of course, that's characteristic of most ancient civilizations until, in the case of the Greeks, the rise of Plato, who wrote dialogues. Socrates spoke, but Plato wrote. And detachment, so that was the last value. A tribalist does not believe in any kind of detachment. A tribalist wants to be involved, wants to be immersed in the world. I mean, the pre-literate tribalists, again, we're talking about ancient civilizations, believed that it was impossible to be detached from the cosmos. The cosmos was everything. The cosmos dictated one's purpose or telos. Post-literate tribalism is somewhat different because the post-literate tribalist also doesn't want to be detached, wants to be involved, wants to intrude upon the business of everyone else in the global village. And the global village is tribalism writ large. But unlike the pre-literate tribalist, the post-literate tribalist wants to reconstruct reality. A pre-literate tribalist would find it inconceivable to reconstruct the cosmos or nature. But the post-literate tribalist, armed with electric and digital technology, wants to reinvent reality. And that's why McLuhan thought that within the electric age, you see a resurgence of magic. Well, I should say a belief in magic, that you can magically create or recreate reality if you don't like it. And of course, that implies that you're not detached from reality. You want to recreate and thus be heavily involved in the reality that you're creating. So.
Right. And just touch on, too, the idea that the involvement relates to a space preference versus time preference, and how the literate tends to, if I've got this right, how the literate society tends to preference time, visual, linear, which lends itself to the idea of progress, if I've understood that correctly. Can you just emphasize that time and space difference?
Yeah, McLuhan took up Harold Innis's famous distinction between space and time media. So his debt to Innis is enormous. But yeah, print media have the bias, you could call it the formal cause, back to Aristotle, preserving time. So obviously books preserve history, and any kind of written medium does that quite well. Space-oriented media represent a different kind of bias or formal cause, in the sense that these are media that are not interested in preserving anything, but they are interested in conquering space, as in overcoming barriers and traditions, expanding the power of a civilization across territories and around the world. So it's no surprise that electric and digital media are space-oriented. They're concerned with what is happening right now, not with the past, but with the eternal now, is one of McLuhan's terms, which doesn't pay any real attention to history in the traditional sense, but is concerned with evolving people and breaking down barriers and traditions. And ultimately creating a global village in which we're all involved with each other. That's very much a space-oriented bias.
Okay, brilliant. Brilliant. So I've just been on the edge of my seat here. This is the most exciting part for me, and I hopefully we haven't overwhelmed listeners and viewers with so much information, because maybe it takes a whole week of reading this book to get the impact of this next part. But just take my word for it. This is really, really important. So just very briefly, we've talked about how environment changes things. Things become obsolete. We're talking about a whole different kind of society, a post-literate society versus a literate society, and how liberalism is really situated within that literate society. And then Professor Havers grabs his hockey stick, leans over the boards, and starts whacking on the boards here at all the post-liberals. It is just awesome. Page 56, your chapter 4, Rearview Mirror Politics. The first sentence actually is a quote from McLuhan. Politics offers yesterday's answers to today's questions, end
Very
quote.
catchy.
Sorry?
Very catchy.
Yeah. And so then you develop that theme, and on page 56, you talk about Patrick Deneen. Now, to be clear, I love Deneen's books. I think you probably enjoy them too. But you're saying, okay, this attack, this deconstruction, shall we say, of liberalism by the post-liberals actually doesn't really make sense, because they're using the presuppositions of a literate citizenry, of a literate society, to critique what's going on in a post-literate society. And page 57, you say this, quote, "If liberalism died with the print age, as McLuhan contends, then Deneen and the other anti-liberal voices on the right are kicking a dead horse," end quote. So tell us about that.
I do remember writing. Yeah, in fairness, the critics of liberalism make the same mistaken assumption as current defenders of liberalism. They both assume that liberalism still exists. And McLuhan's sobering view is it doesn't exist any longer, with the rise of the electric age beginning the invention of the telegraph, 1844. Liberalism begins its long decline and ultimate extinction because, as you mentioned, liberalism is an effect of the print or literate mentality. So for McLuhan, uh, if you don't have literacy, at least as the dominant value within a culture, then you can't have liberalism. I wouldn't want to suggest that McLuhan believed that liberalism was completely irrelevant. He called literacy obsolete. Obsolete is not the same as completely vanished, but it does mean a value that was once dominant has lost its hegemonic influence. So obviously there's still people who are literate, they still read books, but literacy doesn't drive our culture, and that includes our politics, but it does apply to the rear view mirror problem as well. So for McLuhan, we usually understand our present age in terms of the past, to go back to that quote you just mentioned. So in the 19th century, people looked in the mirror and didn't see the 19th century, they saw the Renaissance. In the Renaissance, they looked in the rearview mirror and saw the Middle Ages. They didn't see the Renaissance itself. In the late 20th and early 21st century, conservatives look into the rearview mirror and they see the 19th century, or they might see the 1950s. But if McLuhan is right, they don't see the present age. So that's why Denis is kicking a dead horse. He's attacking a liberalism that no longer exists because the values or preconditions for liberalism no longer exist. But this could apply to other politics as well. There's socialism or other versions of conservatism. I mean, academics and scholars look into a mirror, but like narcissists, they see what they want to see, which is not the same as reality itself.
Yeah, brilliant. And that narcissist comment, you also mentioned how AI developers fall in love with their own creations, with the creations of their own mind. Okay, so we have to talk about money. Everybody cares about economics, and you apply McLuhan to capitalism as well. And I believe capitalism is a Marxist word, so I like to talk about free enterprise. But we'll use capitalism, and because that's what everybody knows. And you mentioned that the objectivity required, the sense of detachment required for capitalism to work, depends on a literate society. And McLuhan says we're in a post-literate society. So how is capitalism, how is the traditional presuppositions of how the economy should work going to continue if we exist in that space? Have I got you right on that? Or basically you're saying our whole economy is walking on in thin air or on thin ice if we don't realize what kind of society we're in right now?
Yeah, well, the kind of capitalism we have today is quite different from, say, capitalism, I think, at least 100 years ago. So it goes back to McLuhan's understanding of the print age and literacy. So bourgeois capitalism, which sounds like a very Marxian term, McLuhan uses it as well. Bourgeois capitalism values privacy, individualism, and detachment because bourgeois capitalists thought in terms of print, the parameters of print media. So what does that mean in terms of example? Well, think of someone like John D. Rockefeller, who one time was the wealthiest man in American history, and of course was famous for developing the oil industry, Standard Oil, for example. For Rockefeller, his personal and private life was just that, private. It had nothing to do with the way that he conducted his business. So he and his contemporaries adhered to a very rigid private-public split, which McLuhan doesn't defend, but he wants to explain it. So to put that another way, Rockefeller believed, as did Randolph Hearst and many others, that their private life was nobody's business, that it had no effect or influence on the way they ran their companies, and everybody should mind their own business, so to speak. That's a simplification of the print mentality. But if we fast forward to our own time, I think it would be hard to imagine Elon Musk thinking in those terms. He does not want to be ignored like Rockefeller did. Rockefeller wanted to be respected as a business person, but he didn't want anyone to pry into his private life. But Elon Musk fits very well with the digital age because he wants to be popular. He wants to be liked. That's why he bought Twitter, after all, and renamed it X. But Musk totally rejects the private-public split. And he's not the only one. Business people today, because of the 24/7 news cycle, because of the relentless spotlight, the digital age, give up their privacy. They don't value it, and they believe that they have to act as public figures in every way, almost like politicians. So that's another distinction that's important. The distinction between politics and business was very surgical in the time of Rockefeller. Politics has to leave like business alone. But I would think most business people in the post-bourgeois capitalist era could not possibly believe that. They can't believe that there's any real daylight between business and the state, which is why in the digital age of post-bourgeois capitalism, the technology industries are only too happy to let the state create surveillance technologies that they can use to spy on everybody. And on that score, there's no real difference between the right and the left. For all the talk of limited government on some factions on the right, for McLuhan, that's just rearview mirror rhetoric. Yeah, businesses want to help the state spy on people or gather information on them. That would be inconceivable to the mind of Rockefeller. In fact, that would be very dangerous. But then again, that's a reflection of the print mentality that my private life is here, my public life is there, and they should not intersect each other.
Yeah, in the margin I wrote, I think George Grant, right? The homogeneous state, where it's arrived. We're here, the fusion of state and society. We're not able to get to all of the beautiful themes, but I wanted to touch on some of the paradoxes that come out. And one of the ideas that McLuhan talks about is the difference between matching versus making, matching content with reality versus making things up on our own. And as I was reading through your book, I kept arguing with you in the column saying, he's saying we're making reality, and I'm going, yeah, but that doesn't make sense. So is he saying there isn't such thing as a reality, or is there such thing as reality? So one of the paradoxes is that McLuhan seems to say we make our own reality. And so I wonder, well, is he just trying to flatter his audience? Is that why he was so popular? Is he being Machiavellian about this and just trying to get people's attention? But then he also, at points, especially towards the end of the book, you talk about him acknowledging a created order. Certainly that was a part of his Catholicism. But it speaks to a sense, at least, that McLuhan had of some sort of fixed reality. And then I'm wondering, well, is he just being esoteric about this? Maybe he's a Straussian. He's trying to hide that belief and pretend like he's talking about reality. So help me sort out. Maybe it's just a paradox that we can't sort out, but sort out for us this tension. He seems to put a ton of emphasis on we make media. Media creates our environment. We're creating a brand new reality, and we are sleepwalking through this new reality. So he's saying to people, wake up. Look, you've created reality. But at the same time, he seems to also believe in actually a fixed reality. So what kind of, there seems to be two realities, and so sort that out for us.
And the quick answer is that's a paradox. But the matching making distinction actually hasn't received a lot of attention in McLuhan literature, so I was delighted by the opportunity to discuss it. But the matching mentality implies a kind of false detachment in which one's mind is trying to match a reality that's independent of the mind. And for McLuhan, there's no such thing. There's no reality that's independent of our minds that make sense of that reality. So for that reason, I believe that it's much better to understand technology in terms of what we make. So it's certainly true. We make our environments through new media, even if we're not aware of what we're making in the process. But I think there are two other reasons why he emphasized this. First, if we are making our reality, then we're also responsible for it. So there's a very tough moral imperative that is at the core of McLuhan's thought here, that we are responsible for what we make, and we have to recognize that, understand what we make, all the more importantly. But the second point has to do with his Christian faith. McLuhan believed that idolatry is one of the most powerful human temptations that is obviously relevant to understanding the creation of technology. We don't simply use our technologies or media, we end up worshiping them, again, like narcissists. And that is the biblical definition of idolatry. We worship false gods. We don't even realize, for the most part, that we have created these gods, but we end up worshiping them. And as a result, we give more power to them than they actually. So this is where, again, McLuhan's debt to his Catholic faith is really important. McLuhan did believe in God. He even believed in natural law and believed in the two books, the book of nature and the book of scripture, which would suggest that, in his view, there is a reality independent of what we do. But the reality that we make is a reality that we are responsible. So one could call that principle, that he does believe in an eternal reality that is independent of our making. But to quote Vico, the great Italian philosopher of the 18th century, McLuhan liked to quote Vico as saying that philosophers need to pay more attention to what human beings make rather than the eternal, which they don't make. A rough paraphrase, but I think McLuhan liked that we may not understand the eternal perfectly, but there's no excuse to have that attitude with respect to what we make, because we should know, we should understand what we are making, and in the process, then we can control and anticipate the effects of what we're making.
Yeah, brilliant. And we don't have time to go into that tension between philosophy and poetry, and ideas versus creating versus, and there's a beautiful section in there where you bring in Vico. I think you bring in certainly Narcissus and idolatry, the Hebrew idea of idolatry, the Greek idea of Narcissus. And you mentioned how Plato wrote about Socrates, saying that we really need to have an oral-based culture. So there's a rich dialogue going on there in the book that's putting in tension the artist and the philosopher, which we don't have time to explore. But I wanted to ask you can comment about it if you want when I ask you this question. But the next paradox for me that I struggled with was McLuhan seems to be pro-literacies, and he's describing literacy as time-based, visual-based, linear. But he also is very big on this simultaneity principle. And simultaneity, he says, in this modern world where everything's all at once, was thought at the speed of light. I think you used the term. It's acoustic, it's oral. And he's saying this is what it is. He seems to be criticizing it a bit, but then he's also criticizing the limits of the literate society with our overemphasis on a linear progression. And he says that just leads to this overinflation and of the idea of progress. So can you sort out for me, he seems to be pro-literacy, but yet he is critical of progress. So and then at the same time also he says we need to look backwards at history to be able to predict the future. Well, how does that fit with simultaneity? So is he just confused? I'm obviously confused, but so can you sort all of that out? His emphasis of simultaneity, his critique of progress, and his emphasis on literacy. So where am I getting confused there?
Yeah, I mean, as a professor of literature, he would be sympathetic with the values of literacy, but he was also tough-minded as to the limitations of a literate culture, which, among other things, leads to distinctions between the private and the public that were problematic in their heyday and don't exist today. And of course, the literate mind sometimes confused its own mentality with a perfectly objective one, which is absurd, which ignores the biases of human experience insofar as we create media. So he could be tough on the effects of literate culture. And of course, literate civilizations can be very intolerant of non-literate ones. They can even wipe them out. So there's a great deal of violence within a literate civilization. Think of the American Civil War. I mean, Mark Knoll, the great evangelical historian, has argued that in some ways the Civil War was a theological crisis, a struggle over how to interpret the Bible. Was the Bible in favor of slavery or not? That kind of conflict is inconceivable without taking into account a literate culture that focuses on one book, the Bible, as the ultimate truth. But you mentioned simultaneity, which is very different from the linear approach to history, in which you have the past and the present and the future all following or preceding each other in an orderly direction. Simultaneity is more paradoxical in the sense that it suggests that the past never actually disappears, in contrast to what the linear mind says, and the future is present as well, which is important to keep in mind if one is trying to anticipate the future before it happens, which is what formal causality or the tetrads are all about. So the past and the future always coexist with the present. That's a brief definition of simultaneity. Why is that important? Because I think for McLuhan, the modern literate mind was very mistaken in dismissing religion as, for example, as a phenomenon that belonged to the past, the Dark Ages, for example, out of which comes the progressivist view that if we are truly enlightened, we have to give up religion in favor of a secular alternative. For McLuhan, that's just bad history. Because religion never disappears. It's not simply part of the past. He associated religion with myth. Myths are not falsehoods, according to McLuhan, but they are stories that help us understand things at the speed of light. A myth can explain a reality that a theory of history cannot explain as well or as quickly. So religion or myth never actually disappears. Modern literate minds may deny the importance of myths, but then they have trouble explaining why what used to be called archaic beliefs, like a belief in magic, have not disappeared and in fact enjoy a new life within the digital age.
Brilliant. So with your comments about myth, that takes us around to focusing on solutions. And you talk about our discarnate reality, or our discarnate identity in a social media age, and how I think you make the comment at once, or he made the comment that it takes a religion to fight a false religion, or it takes a true religion to fight a false religion. And the idea that we can't come up with a material solution for a discarnate identity. So I wonder if you could talk about is the concept of our discarnate identity with and tie that into your chapter on apocalypse and kind of, an unveiling, a waking up to what's going on, and maybe even throw in a rediscovery of books if that fits. But can you tie that together with social media, discarnate identity? What's the solution to a discarnate identity, and how does apocalypse tie in with that?
Yeah, discarnate identity is one that exists without a body. So for McLuhan, when we're on the telephone, we are not using our bodies per se. The phone, in a sense, doesn't require that. And in a way, that's true of other electronic, certainly digital media. That may not be bad under every circumstance, but I think for McLuhan, if you push this current identity, so an identity that doesn't require a body, to its extreme, then troubles will result. And incidentally, consistent with formal causality, McLuhan believes that every technology will be pushed to its extreme. So to put this in a very sobering way, an atomic bomb will be used at some point. That's its essence. That's its extreme use, but that's also its essence. So electric and digital media give the impression that we don't need our bodies to communicate. I argued in the book that this has a lot in common with Gnosticism, which in and of itself is a complex doctrine. But I think this is where McLuhan and Eric Vogelin agree on a very important fact, that the Gnostic, put simply, is someone who wants to escape the material world into a spiritual world. So the Gnostic is very dualistic. There's a material, and then there's the spiritual. And the spiritual is always superior to the material. Electric and digital media encourage this type of attitude, and I think that bothered McLuhan because, for one thing, it is dualistic. It devalues the material world in favor of something that is only falsely or inauthentically spiritual. I mean, as a Christian, as a Thomist, defender of Aquinas' philosophy, is simply wrong to separate the body from the mind in this sense. From a Christian perspective, the body and the mind, or body and the soul for that matter, are equally creations of God. They're both good. They're both important. This parallels his distinction between the book of nature and the book of scripture. They're different, but they're both good. They're both worthy of preservation. But electric and digital media really aggravate this Gnostic dualism, which leads to a great deal of fragmentation and confusion over what reality is. But it's also magical. What could be more magical than to pretend that one's body, one's material existence is not important, and to embrace the kind of the spirit of the internet or social media. So for McLuhan, I think he and Bruce Powers even used the term schizophrenic. This idea of a divided reality is bad. Usually McLuhan didn't like making moral judgments. He did in his first book, which I neglected to mention, The Mechanical Bride. He launched into a very moral critique of advertising. But in his mature work, he tried to avoid that as much as possible. But having said that, he worried about the prevalence of Gnosticism in academia, but also in Hollywood, in the media industries of his time. Because, again, it's very tempting, it's very human to believe that we need to escape from a material reality into something more spiritual. But for McLuhan, he wants us to praise both or to value both realities. Otherwise, we're stuck in this kind of toxic dualism.
So he's not a Platonist.
No. And of course, he had a bone to pick with Plato. I discussed that in my book. I think he did like the cave allegory uh, from Book 7 of the Republic. But yeah, he often used the term Platonism as kind of the philosophical equivalent of Gnosticism. I think Plato scholars would be very unhappy
Yes.
with that. And it goes back to his view that Plato was hard on the poets, that Plato was hard on literary people. Of course, McLuhan took the side of poetry against a kind of objective or detached philosophy that he believed Plato defended. One can debate that. But certainly McLuhan rejected dualism, the surgical division of one reality from another, and plus the belief that one reality, the spiritual, is superior to another. Of course, materialists make the opposite mistake. They think the material is better than the spiritual, or it's the only reality. So McLuhan wants to reject that.
Yeah. Now, so we said he's not he had a bone to pick with Plato, but then you mentioned he loved his cave, and you have a whole chapter on the electric cave. So we can't mention the cave without making a comment about the cave. And actually, when I started reading that chapter, I said, why didn't you just mention Leo Strauss's cave beneath the cave? And then halfway through the chapter, you actually do mention Strauss. But
The second
yeah,
cave.
talk about the cave.
Yeah, I think the cave allegory is a wonderful metaphor for understanding electric and digital media. So, despite his misgivings towards Plato, I think there are times in which McLuhan sees value in the cave allegory in terms of the medium as the message or the message as well, that people who live in a cave are not even aware that they're living in a cave in which, at best, they understand shadows or images of reality, but not reality itself. So that's a wonderful way of understanding people who are not aware of how ignorant they are of the reality in which they live. But of course, there's some good news. Some people can escape from the cave, but if they feel obligated to their fellow human beings, they have to go back into the cave and enlighten as to their ignorance. And so I point out at one point that this might explain why McLuhan got so much criticism, really vicious criticism, probably motivated by academic jealousy during the 60s, because I think McLuhan used his media celebrity not to enrich himself. I think he enjoyed being popular, being a human being, but I think he saw it as an opportunity to go back into the caves after understanding formal causality and other truths, to enlighten people, to use interviews on TV and speeches to wake people up as to how little they understand of a cave, which they themselves have created technologically. So we're back to making versus magic. Has that awakening happened? You mentioned apocalypse. Of course, apocalypse comes from the Greek word for unveiling or revealing or awakening. Being a Christian, he did not, McLuhan was not a pessimist. I think he would have agreed with William Buckley that despair is a sin, so let's not. For McLuhan, to think about apocalypse is to hope for a revealing of the truth. But apocalypse, as you know, also refers to a cosmic conflict between good and evil at the end of history. So that's a long way of saying that for McLuhan, human beings will learn the hard way as to how ignorant they are of the cave which they themselves have fabricated. Ignorance is costly. Believing that one's identity is discarnate comes with a price, psychologically and spiritually. So McLuhan wasn't trying to depress people, but he did believe, as a Christian, that human beings are sinful, and more often than not, they'll use technologies in ways that are harmful or ways that they don't even understand. So it may take some earth-shattering events to wake people up.
Yeah. And thinking of the suffering, you mentioned at one point, I believe you were quoting McLuhan, that humans would find it unbearable if they had to deal with the absence of the telephone, the TV, and the movie theater for even, a day or two. And now the internet, we would just find that to be an incredibly painful experience. And so to your point about coming out of that cave, experiencing an awakening and a revealing, I can't see how it wouldn't be painful. And so I wanted to end with this question. And I always ask, what have I missed? So that'll be the last question. But the second last question is, as we try to get practical, uh, at the end, page 149, I believe, you said that his, quote, his playful use of probes, puns, and put-ons had nothing in common with creating a new blueprint for the future, given the fact that the future usually reflects the biases of the present in any case, end quote. And this is something I've struggled with for 2.5 decades in policymaking, where it's not just the fact that we're writing. There's not just the policy that we're writing. It's the fact that we're writing policy at all. And so I'm trying to say, no, we have to get outside of this cave. We shouldn't be writing a plan at all. Not the fact that we should be writing a better plan. We should be leaving it up to people to make their own plans. And so that's just one concrete example of how it's almost the metaphor came to mind, or image came to mind, of McLuhan being a pacifist in an MMA contest. So he's out there saying, "No, I'm pacifist, but you're going to get beat up if you." So how do modern day intellectuals, leaders, politicians, policy people apply this kind of thinking in a world that really demands the concrete, the literal, that it all at once? Well, I'm not even sure. It seems like we're trying to apply the literate to a post-literate age that is trapped within a cave. Is the best that we can hope for is to aim at puns, probes, and put-ons? Like, is that our modus operandi going forward? Because we're never going to be able to convince, like, we can't use logic to convince people. What are your thoughts on that? Like, how do we behave given everything that McLuhan said? How do we behave?
Yeah, it is McLuhan often admitted he wasn't in the solution business. He used puns, probes, and put-ons because he knew that in the electric age, a catchphrase can have more impact. It can be understood more instantaneously than, say, a book on the studied media. So I think he would continue to recommend, though in our own age, we're deluged with people who think they're as clever as McLuhan and can use those catchphrases. So maybe we become desensitized to that. I think two other things come to mind. McLuhan thought that a democracy would probably be best suited to have some kind of conversation about the effects of technology. But I think he thought that in a very cautious way. Because in his view, democracies are not necessarily healthy regimes. He believed that a literate democracy had gone the way of the dodo bird. Any post-literate democracy, a tribalist democracy, can be quite intolerant and vicious and coercive, as we well know. So he didn't pin all his hopes on that. I think he did want more awareness within big business. as to the effects of technology, which is why he spent much of his time giving speeches to various corporate executives. But in his Playboy interview, which came out in 1969, he does refer to the importance of environmental programming, that one has to make an effort, presumably a democratic effort, to think about an environment before it actually is created by a new medium. But that's difficult, and that's never really been done. Part of the problem is that within the high-tech industries, as you know, there is a space-oriented bias, or a bias based on speed. I mean, there's overlap between them. A rush to market kind of bias, in which you bring new technologies to market as soon as possible to make more money, to make sure that your competitors don't do the same thing. Well, in that context, it's impossibly difficult to anticipate effects before they happen because the product has already been introduced. So I think McLuhan would not be surprised by high-tech executives who now say, oh my gosh, these effects are happening. We've got to do something about it. That's like the old story of closing the barn door after the livestock have escaped. That's typical of human experience. We worry about an effect after it has taken root. So now schools want to ban smartphones, laptops after they've been around for many years. So I think that's why McLuhan was not an optimist or a pessimist, but in his own view, thought that one could only hope that awareness would kick in at some point among powerful as well as among ordinary citizens. And I think that's why he used his celebrity to raise this awareness, even though later on he admitted in private correspondence that he probably hadn't had much success there. So at best, I think he was hopeful, but in a very cautious way.
Interesting. What have I missed about McLuhan in general, or about your book in particular?
Well, I think McLuhan was a conservative. And I emphasize that in the book because that is not the conventional view of McLuhan. Many people thought, especially during his heyday, that he was welcoming and defending the changes brought about by electric technology, especially television. And he said in an interview that he is opposed to all change, all innovation, but he wants to try to understand it. And he was frustrated by the attitude that if you talk about something, then you're in favor of it. You must be in favor of it, which was completely untrue in his case. So he was a conservative in the sense that, in a way, he lamented that the end of literacy as a dominant value, despite the limitations of the literate mentality. I mean, in his view, if there's no literacy, then in a way, there's no such thing as civilizations as we know it. And I know that sounds very logocentric, I guess. But for McLuhan, if you don't have literacy, you're not going to have a democracy in a sense that, say, old-fashioned liberals once defended democracy. So the fact that he thought in very Thomistic terms. Again, he made a distinction between the book of nature and the book of scripture, but in the process defended natural law as a necessary counterweight to the discarnate identities popping up all over the global village. And speaking of the global village, he didn't believe that bringing people together through electric technology would make us like each other. I think many people were offended. But the fact is, a global village can also be what's called a bloody schoolhouse, a very violent schoolhouse, in which, yes, we're involved with each other, but it doesn't mean that we like each other. They're simply more aware. So I would call that a conservative view that would definitely counter progressivist views in our country.
Brilliant. The medium is still the message. Marshall McLuhan for Our Time by Professor Grant Havers. It's just out this month. If you know anyone on your shopping list who's even mildly interested in Marshall, but certainly if you're interested in social media, AI, autonomous weapon systems, foreign policy, Hollywood, I mean, you make this text so relevant to what's happening right now. Anyways, I'll have to try to read McLuhan again. I've always found him a bit tough to read because I feel like he's trying to be cool and hip, but kind of 60s with all these catchphrases. And so if you feel guilty that you haven't read McLuhan, go out and buy Dr. Havers' book, and then you'll gain an appreciation for McLuhan, and maybe you'll go read the primary text. But Grant, it's been fantastic. Thank you so much for your time, and this has been really helpful.
So, thank you, Sean.
Okay, we'll talk again soon.